Hello, Greg, and welcome to the Growing Up Weird podcast. My name's Gwen Bradbury. I'm a healthcare consultant, and I help people to see how they can set children up for better adult health by making some small changes in their early childhood.
Are you telling me that people should be growing up weird? And what is weird?
Weird stands for Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic cultures. Cultures like ours, in fact. Most of us joining this podcast will live in weird cultures in the US, UK and much of Western Europe. In this podcast, we explore the physical effects on children when they grow up in weird cultures like ours. Speaking of weird people, who are you, Greg?
A, how dare you? I'm still not used to being called weird. B, I'm also a healthcare consultant. I am a vet with a background in pathophysiology, and I'm really interested in how tech and devices interact with tissue. I try very hard to stay on top of what's new in tech and tissue. So if you don't mind, I think we should start with some news. In fact, I think we should start every week with some news. Yes?
Great idea. Let's do it.
Wicked. What have you got?
A lot of people this week have been sending me an article about childhood constipation. How about that for a great first topic? But about a couple of weeks ago, I wrote an article on how to set a kid's guts up for great long-term health. And this week, paper out, childhood constipation diagnoses have risen 60% in the last decade. I mean, that's quite hard to engage with, right? But fundamentally, what it means is that kids are having real problems going to the toilet, and it's getting more and more common. And constipation's horrible for kids, and it's really stressful for adults. I've seen several friends struggling to help their children through it. And constipation is just one of those things that's so dependent on a child's environment. What they eat, how they move, how they go to the toilet, how stressed they are. There are loads of things that happen. About a year ago, I was sitting reading an article in the British Medical Journal about childhood constipation.
I have to ask, Gwen, where were you sitting reading this article?
Great question. So I was sitting reading the British Medical Journal on the toilet because if you have 3 kids, there are a few places where you can actually guarantee that you've got enough time to read something. So yeah, I'm sitting on the toilet and I'm reading about childhood constipation. Don't we all? And I'm going through the article and I'm looking line to line, heading to heading. There's so much about drugs and there is nothing about diet. And diet is one of the really key pieces in constipation. And over the next few weeks, as I look in the letters pages, I'm not the only person who is wondering how we have missed out on this key piece we can modify. There are lots of doctors saying, come on, folks, if we're talking constipation, we need to be thinking diet. But it's not always that obvious. We often turn to drugs because they seem like the easiest solution. Actually, it's not even just about diet. There was an article recently from China that looked at the risk of constipation who were toileted in different ways as babies. You're probably thinking, toileted, babies, what are you talking about? Surely babies just wee and poop in nappies or diapers, right? Stop a moment. How do parents deal with babies weeing and pooping when there are no nappies? Have you ever considered it? Parents of babies without diapers hold the babies in a special position to encourage them to urinate and defecate, wee and poop. It's kind of a sitting squat where you hold the babies under the thighs. And if you hold the babies in this position, whenever you think the baby might need to go to the toilet, you actually find that they start to learn pretty quickly. At birth, they've got a reflex, and soon it becomes voluntary. It becomes under their control. And this process is called elimination communication. But what this paper said that was so cool was that it turns out that babies who are held out to toilet during babyhood are 10 times less likely to develop childhood constipation. 10 times. If elimination communication were a drug, it would be an absolute blockbuster, Greg. It's such an enormous reduction.
I mean, what are we expecting we would see if that were a drug? We'd see like a 50% improvement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 50% would be, I think that's actually pretty high, because usually the drugs, you have to do them in conjunction with dietary modifications and really regular helping the children go to the toilet. So it's not just a drug that you give and then suddenly everything is fine.
And you're seeing a 1,000% improvement. where you're saying that 50 would be a real surprise with a drug.
Absolutely.
It's just it's a different way of thinking about efficacy.
Yeah. It's just not very easy to monetize, which is probably why you haven't heard of it and why it's at the moment it's still quite a niche topic with an uncomfortable name. But I'm feeling, at least hopefully now, we're starting to get a bit more airtime about this in weird cultures, and that's going to be fantastic for kids' gut health. Anyway, constipation aside, Greg, what have you been reading this week?
I've been reading about paternal care, which obviously, as a father, I'm quite interested in. There's a paper that was reviewed in Science Daily a couple of days ago, which was done by some folks called Reed Donathan, phenomenal name, et al. In Sex Roles, also phenomenal name. Is it D&D? Is it a scientific journal? I don't know. Anyway, they looked at maternal gatekeeping. If you've not come across maternal gatekeeping, it is an accidental thing that happens when mums are pushed into doing a lot of the care and then end up so used to doing so much of the care that it then becomes very difficult for anybody else to help. Been there?
Yeah, I can totally recognise that. I've felt that myself.
Yeah, a lot of mothers have, it turns out. Who knew? But what's quite interesting about it is that not only does it push away offers of care or even non-spoken attempts at care from a partner, potentially a father, but it also reduces the input of care from neighbours, other more distant family, allo parents of all sorts. Folks, if you're not familiar with allo parents, listen to episode 6 and episode 8. He says optimistically. No, it's just the idea that other people can do parenting jobs other than the mother and the father. Anyway, this gatekeeping is accidental and generally not great for the mother's mental health, workload, life balance, all of the things that, fade to grey and crispy when you have children. And so these folks, Reed Donathan et al., interviewed 182 couples over the course of before they had a kid, 3 months after they had a kid, 6 months after they had a kid, 9 months after they had a kid, and looked at increased parental leave from the father's workplace, and looked at whether it made a difference to eventual maternal gatekeeping. Newsflash, of course it did. The longer a father spent caring for the new baby improves father-baby bond, improves baby-father bond, improves father's ability to do general jobs such as cleaning, feeding, caring, stopping crying, getting up at night, etc. But the major thing here is that it allows more care to be offered to the mother. I am curious, they didn't test this, but I am very curious whether that increases the amount of allo-parent care allowed. Because this is something we see within weird parents, right? That the mother and the father have to make every decision going. Mm-hmm. Normally the mother has to make every decision going. Do you think it would be interesting if do you think it's likely that this would allow more allo-parent care and therefore more ideas from outside the home?
Fascinating. I think it can't help but allow you to relax the stranglehold you feel you have on your child's health and welfare when you think everything is dependent on you. That'll be a really interesting thing. I bet someone will study that soon, I hope.
If they haven't, please do. Just definitely go and interview a bunch of parents and see then how permeable that household becomes to outside ideas. This is something... Go on, you were going to say.
I was actually going to say, Greg, do you remember the first day of parental leave you had with our first child?
I can't say I do. I was stressed out. Do you remember the first day of parental leave I had with our child?
I remember hot cups of tea at work. I remember having complete freedom, complete quiet, wondering about the baby, sure, but cycling home, I'd had such a lovely ride. I could see the house coming towards it and I'm smelling smoke in the air. And as I get right up to the fence, I can hear crackling of flames. And I'm thinking, I open the door. And there is my baby in a little bouncy chair. Great big fire in front of her. Greg stoking the fire. she's happy as Larry. And I thought, you know what? In the last 9 months of my maternity leave, there is not one day where I've thought, what my baby needs is a fire.
She just looked like she wanted a fire, all right? It was cold and miserable, and she was cold and miserable, and I thought, this child needs a fire to sit around. We didn't have cigars or whiskey, we just sat around. Anyway, great paper, interesting stuff. But one thing to note is massive limitation on this trial, which is they only interviewed rich, white Americans. This is an effect which really needs looking at in different cultures, as I think you are probably about to tell us. Things happen differently in different cultures, yes?
They do, Greg.
What is it we're talking about this week that changes in different cultures?
So this week's topic is crooked teeth and jaw size and face shape. Recent article written on Substack, and obviously this is a podcast to explore it in a little bit more depth. Let's talk a little bit more about teeth and jaws. Happy with that, Greg?
Oh yeah, I'm going to throw questions at you throughout if that's all right.
Perfect. Okay, so today we're talking crooked teeth, we're talking jaw size, we're talking face shape in weird cultures. But I'm going to ask you, Greg, a little bit about the evolution here, because that is where the really cool stuff comes in.
Oh, I see. Throw it to the paleontology nerd. How dare you? All right, fine. Teeth. Way back when we were jawless fish, which we were, I'm sorry to break that to people, long time ago, 500-ish million years ago, jawless fish, sucking up food, eventually realizing that we couldn't chew it with anything because we didn't have any teeth. So we moved the point at which we chewed from inside our gullet to between some of our scales. We were scaly jawless fish, and started using those scales to mash up food. Over time, those scales changed shape, but they were still scales, not bones, very much scales. As they changed shape, that hard outer covering that scales still have became the outside of our teeth. And the fact that we now say, oh, isn't it weird that sharks are covered in enamel? No, it's not. It's weird that our teeth are covered in shark outsidiness.
That blew my mind when you first told me that. I was like, how did I not know that sharks are covered in teeth?
They're not. Our mouths are full of scales. Anyway, we then became much more bony, and we started putting bones all over the place, or rather calcifying and mineralizing our soft tissues. We mineralized one of our gill arches to make a jawbone, and it has now pockets in that those scales fit into. So the teeth in the jawbone can be thought about as scales within a mineralized gill arch. The interesting thing about that is that the shape, color, pattern, etc. of scales is absolutely genetically determined, right? Your genes tell your teeth what shape and size to be. And if your mother and father had big teeth, then you have big teeth. And if your mother and father had small teeth, then you have small teeth. But bone is a whole different game. Bone changes shape depending on how much stress you put through it. And it grows if you stress it more, especially while you're growing in childhood. And it stops growing if you stop stressing it. And if you keep stressing it in adulthood, it gets thicker, etc., etc. It's very responsive. So you've got the initial shape from your genes, and the later shape is refined by how you use it, your environment, your behavior. You can see, therefore, that the teeth, I'm going to keep doing that. It's going to freak out a dentist one day. The teeth are genetically determined might not fit perfectly into a jaw, which is not genetically determined. And that ain't evolution's fault. That's just weirdness that goes on, which I think you're probably going to touch on in just a second. Tell us more.
I'm actually going to think back. Do you remember when we were in South America and we were living in little Amerindian village, and I was speaking to an older man, one of the village leaders, and I said to him, do you have children in your village whose teeth are crooked? And he had to think really hard about it. As he was talking, I was watching his own teeth. They were white and they fit so beautifully. I was actually running my tongue around the inside of my teeth, feeling all the little knobbles where I've got the canines that stick out, the incisors that are wonky. I just couldn't help it because his were so smooth. And he said, I know what you are saying. I have seen it recently. And he was absolutely right, because I didn't see it in any adults. But as I looked around, I was starting to see crookedness appearing in the children of the sort of school-age children in this village. We were seeing that change in action. But what was that change about, Greg?
Okay, so that's an interesting one. Clearly, their teeth weren't changing shape. They would have the same shaped teeth as their fathers, their grandfathers, or if you want to be less sexist about it, their parents, grandparents, etc. Their jawbones, however, probably were exposed to a different load. I'm guessing, this was at the village on the junction of the two rivers, yes?
It was, yeah.
Yes. Where up until quite recently, food was very much hunted or caught in the river or grown on a farm. Mm-hmm. And it was all tough as old boots. No, don't get me wrong. Honestly, it was delicious.
Yeah.
It's just hard work.
Yeah.
And it's hard work for me because I'm a Western wuss and I've got tiny little piddly little jaw. But if you can then imagine that larger boats with larger engines were brought to an upstream city so that a boat full of supplies could arrive in the village. It used to be once a week. It's now... Mm-hmm. My word. It used to be once a week and it's now, what, twice?
Yeah.
3 times a week?
Yeah.
Anyway, it becomes a lot more easy to feed kids on a much more processed diet. I've seen bags of pasta and rice going to that village.
Do you remember the fried dough?
I do remember the fried dough. It was delicious.
Yeah.
It just turned into goo in your mouth, which was awesome.
But
for a Westerner.
What also blew my mind is that that's really recent because they didn't have cooking oil until actually fairly recently. Everything was boiled. Because how do you get cooking oil?
Okay, mostly boiled.
Mm-hmm.
They did occasionally fry stuff in cookrit grease, which is awesome.
That's true.
And disgusting.
Yeah.
Anyway, cookrit grubs, if you've never eaten them, are wiggly and coconut flavoured and luckily don't bite you in the mouth like some other foods. Anyway, yeah, so what you're dealing with there is kids who have had a softer diet than their ancestors. Those ancestors who had evolved a perfectly sized jaw to fit their teeth. You then take away some of that jaw growth stimulus by making the diet softer. The jaw doesn't grow so much. And those teeth, which there's nothing going to change the size or shape of those, suddenly don't have enough room to fit together. They do their best. They shuffle up really close, getting rid of those saliva spaces in between, which you're meant to have a gap between all your teeth for saliva to flow between and prevent you getting cavities. Most of us don't have that anymore. They did that, and then you start running out of space and teeth start coming forward, backwards, sideways, diagonally. And yeah, you're right. There was the very beginnings of that in that village. But it's nowhere near as bad as you would see if you just walked around in the UK.
Yeah. So that's the kind of how we've got here in the first place. But the last bit that I was talking about in the article was actually what you can do, because I think it's really easy to just hear all these messages and feel really dispirited. You know, where's the human race going? Is this just a downward slide till we're all like, the people in WALL-E? But no, I have...
Sorry, it took me a second. Yes, like them. I love them.
But there's stuff that we can do, and there's stuff that we can do at different ages. And I think that's where things get really interesting. One of the things that we always talk about when we're talking about jaw development is breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is such a good workout for the jaw because boobs are really heavy. But actually, what's really cool about breastfeeding is that the work that it does for a baby's face is actually very different from the nutrition that a baby is getting. So a lot of people really, really struggle to provide enough milk for their babies. And at the moment, people see it as a very binary choice. If you can't breastfeed, then you bottle feed. But it's so worthwhile. If you've got a baby and you're struggling to breastfeed, you're struggling to make enough milk, absolutely look at ways to give them the milk that they need, but also do everything you can to try to keep breastfeeding even a little bit for as long as you can, because that is the single biggest thing that you can do to help that jaw grow. And one of the themes that is going to come up, Greg, we talk about it a lot, the time to act. You get the biggest gains the earlier you do it. Doesn't mean you can't sort things out and you can't fix things later, but you have to do a lot more work.
Can I drop in some numbers there?
Please.
Right. For anybody listening who likes a number, the jaw of a child is 75% of its adult size by the time that child is 4 years old, and it is 90% of its adult size by the time that child is 12. So you can have about 75% of the effect you are ever going to have by the kid's 4th birthday. And then you've got another 15% to play with, ish, in the next 8 years. And then after that, good luck. Bon chance. Chew hard. You'll make a difference, but it's not going to be massive. But if you can, like, feed your kid on mostly bricks and roots for those for those first 3.5 years. No, I'm sorry. Bricks and roots is stupid. But okay, what is it we should be aiming for here, Gwen?
If you can getting children to have to chew foods that are tough or hard is the piece that we're aiming for here. And when you go, what does that look like? It means choose bread that is chewy, not bread that is soft. Give them whole pieces of root vegetables. Don't chop them up. Mm-hmm. Give them whole apples. Give them nuts.
Sorry, how are you meant to cook a whole root vegetable? Because I've tried roasting a potato before.
Don't cook them. Make sure that they have enough raw vegetables to actually get a proper chew on the food. And one thing I found really interesting was that there was a study recently that looked at young children and looked at whether they preferred soft foods. Because, you know, if you look at baby foods, what do we think of? Some kind of sludge in a jar, right? Or in one of those little funny squeezy pouches.
Yeah, tubagoo.
Tubagoo, some kind of slime. But actually, young kids apparently don't have a preference for soft food. That is not an intrinsic thing. But interestingly, as you get older and, you know, kid foods are, you know, flavours of slime, then you find that the older kids get more into soft foods, but actually the really young ones aren't. So just trying to make sure that you capitalise on that period where the child wants to eat hard food and you give them the raw vegetables, you get them used to doing some good chewing. That's going to do enormous things to help set up their jaw.
I guess that can go one of two ways at teething as well, right? Because with our kids, I definitely saw that when their mouths hurt, either absolute pureed, what do they call it in fancy restaurants? Like a reduction of parsley cream.
Jus.
Exactly, a jus. They're looking for a jus. Or they want a cold, hard, chewy thing because it just helps get rid of the pain. And I guess you can take either of those solutions, but one's going to help with the teething. Whereas I guess the other one might help with nutrition. What do you do if you're worried about nutrition here?
That's a great point. But fortunately, scientists have looked at that one as well. And yes, when you are weaning a baby, they will start, you want them to start to actually take on food, so they start to get some nutrition from that food. But it doesn't have to be all purees. You might have things that are generally sludgy and slimy, but still acceptable to adults. Things like hummus, things like that are very easy baby foods. But also, we can think about what people in other cultures do when they're weaning children in the first place. And one of the things that they do when they don't have a puree, a blender, is to chew bits of their own food that's particularly tough and give it to the baby in a little bolus or even directly mouth to mouth. And that sounds pretty gross if you live in Western cultures, but hear me out, because it provides something that purees absolutely cannot, and it gives some nutrition in a way that just giving them hard foods can't do.
I saw this. You talked about this in the article, right?
Yeah.
Great name.
Yeah, pre-mastication. Well, a bit of a mouthful as a name, ha ha ha. But yeah, certainly when you chew up a bit of food, say you chew, I don't know, some nuts or you chew some raw vegetable and you give it to the baby, then actually when they have it in their mouth, even before they have teeth, they're learning the sensation of dealing with small pieces of hard food. And that's a really important piece that they have to learn, to move them around their mouth and to swallow them, so that when they start to get the teeth that can chip off small bits of hard food, they've already got the oral motor skills to be able to deal with it. If you only ever feed children on, different forms of sludges, different purees, then actually, even when they start to bite and get bits of hard food in their mouth, they might not have the strength to deal with it. So already it's much harder for them to learn to like it.
Oh, that's pretty cool. All right, so we've talked what's going on. We've talked why it happens. We all know the kind of orthodontic mouth explosion, teeth everywhere that can happen. We know the aesthetics of this. Mm-hmm. You got 30 seconds on what it does other than make you look like Austin Powers.
Yes, so what we do know is when the jaw doesn't grow forward and as wide as it should, it's not just the dental arcade itself, the line of teeth itself that is affected, but it's also all the structures further back in the mouth as well. So especially the airway. Let's talk about the airway because I think that's the simplest one to talk about. In order for air to get into your body, you've got a few holes around at the back of your nose and in your mouth. And if your jaw doesn't grow enough, those holes are smaller. What does that mean? It means that it's already harder for air to get through. But it also means if you've got a smaller jaw, you've got less space for your tongue. You've got less space for the tissue at the back of your throat. So if you have a small jaw, you're much more likely to start snoring. And as you get older, you're much more likely to develop sleep apnea, which is a terrifying condition where when you're sleeping and everything's relaxed, your tongue and your soft tissues fall back and block your airway a bit. So you wake up with a start because it feels like you're suffocating. Sleep apnea is awful.
I can vouch for that. I do this. It sucks. This is why I invented my most recent anti-sleep apnea device, which is a big piece of Duplo tied between my shoulder blades with a bootlace. It is very uncomfortable, but it does stop you lying on your back and snoring and then dying, which is what can happen if you keep doing this for 40 or 50 years. Okay, this is useful. So you're talking about aesthetics, you're talking about quality of bite, you're talking about how well you can breathe. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about this when I read about it is it affects your quality of speech and communication in older age, which can tie into dementia. Like, this is something that I thought was fascinating. People's mouths shrink generally as they age. Normally that's because of tooth decay, leading to less stress going through the bones because you can only thin gruel. If you started with a larger mouth, you end up with a slightly larger mouth, which means it is easier to be heard. Not being heard puts people off from even bloomin' trying, and not trying to communicate is one of the things that contributes to the mental degradation and dementia of old age.
That is really sad. I didn't know that. But yeah, anyway, folks, a great reason to get your babies chewing on more food.
Yeah, because in 105 years, they'll have less dementia. This is the thing that you will see. No, strike that. This is the thing that you will hear again and again as you tune into this podcast over the coming weeks. That Gwen is going to suggest some things that you can do which will not have a payoff for 50 years. But when they do, that payoff is enormous. Gwen, I would love to wrap this up. Are there any closing comments you want to give these folks on malocclusion?
I would say that the biggest piece to take away from this podcast is that crooked teeth are not at all inevitable, but you need to be thinking about them really, really early. And if you think about setting up your kids to grow their jaws properly when they are, still growing their baby teeth, you will have a much, much better chance of having kids who don't end up with the problems that come when your jaw's too small.
Nice. Thank you. All right. At this point, because this is episode 1, we're going to wrap. But in episode 2 and ongoing, this is going to be the stage at which we answer questions, or rather, I force Gwen to answer questions that have been written into us from listeners or readers of the blog. So, get those questions into us. I'll fire them at Gwen with no pre-warning, and we'll see what happens. It's a kind of question super collider situation. Anyway, that's enough from me, and...
That's enough for me. Thank you for joining.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.